Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser. Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, Terrorism, commonly known as the Graham-Talent WMD Commission, was established because of a key recommendation found in the 9/11 Commission report. The WMD Commission was established by House Resolution 1, Section 1851, to assess within 180 days any and all of the nation's activities, initiatives, and programs to prevent weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, and terrorism. That report was delivered to the President and to Congress on December 2nd, 2008. With us today is former United States Senator Jim Talent, Vice Chairman of the WMD Commission. Since today's subject is so broad, Senator Talent has agreed to have this dialogue in two 30-minute discussions. Part 1 will focus on the prevention of bioterrorism. Part 2 will focus on the prevention of nuclear terrorism. In this first part, we will discuss what bioterrorism is, why it is difficult to detect in advance, and what can be done to improve the advanced detection. We're very pleased to have Senator Talent with us today. He's made himself available. Welcome, Jim Talent, to the conversation.
Thank you, Lee. It's good to be here with you.
So let's just jump in. This is an enormous subject. First, we'll start at the very base. What is bioterrorism?
Well, it's the use of biological agents to effectively attack nations. It's the use of biological agents as weapons of mass destruction. And it's been around for a long time, a couple generations. But the difference is that in the past, life science technology had not advanced to the point that bioweapons were accessible to non-government actors. So you needed to be a nation state.
Like the United States or Russia or China.
Yeah, a major nation state to be able to develop a bioweapon. Well, life science has advanced, and that's a good thing. I mean, you know, all the life science research has achieved a great deal, but a downside of it is that it is now possible for a small group of people at a relatively small cost to isolate and weaponize a pathogen and then use it in the service of terrorism, and that's what we mean when we talk about a bioweapon.
Mm-hmm. As you just said, a small group in a lab. We're going to be talking about nuclear terrorism in the second part, but here in the first part where we're talking about bio, it turns out that there is much less oversight of these various sites that you're talking about than people who deal with any kind of nuclear material. You want to just address that?
Yeah, there's two things to consider. One is internationally, and then one domestically. Okay, now domestically, the labs that deal with the most dangerous pathogens.
This would be like Ebola.
Yeah, Ebola. Weaponized anthrax, botulism, or you can use genetics now, of course, to create new ones, which is one of the problems. Right. They are heavily regulated. There's a concern, though, because the regulation has been, at least up to the point of our report, it was a dual regulation. So Homeland Security did it, the Department of HHS did it, in some cases the Agriculture Department did it, if it was on animal research or that sort of thing. And so you had competing regulations and different standards, and there was a question as to whether or not it was being adequately regulated. Probably, though, and I think we emphasize this in the report, I mean, the bigger danger is less that somebody will steal a pathogen from a lab that is legitimately dealing with it than that they'll get $100,000 and recruit a life scientist to the terrorist movement and go build their own lab and create it. I mean, you can get anthrax in nature.
Right.
So you get it, you can get, if you want to do agroterrorism, you can get foot and mouth disease. I mean, there's lots of things you can do: isolate, weaponize, and then use. So
now you said weaponize. See, that from what my reading shows is the more difficult part. Having the anthrax is part one, but
you can't just, you can throw it up in the air, but that doesn't make it a bioweapon. You have to actually know how to turn it into an aerosol and be able to distribute it. So talk about the difficulties there.
That is an obstacle they have to overcome, but it's much easier than it used to be, again, because of the nature of life science and technology. So the classic model, when the DHS models an attack, which they've done, to determine the consequences of it, they'll use anthrax, let's say, and one possible model would be to get anthrax to isolate the most deadly forms of the spores that you can get, to turn it into a powder or a slurry of some kind. Then you get a pickup truck with a shell on it. You get a paint sprayer, okay, and you punch a hole in the top of the shell, and then you go into a densely populated area. I mean, think St. Louis the night of July 4th when everybody's on the riverfront. And then
or the World Series.
Or the World Series, or of course they've modeled this in New York. And then you drive up and down at night, and you spray the stuff up into the air. At night you can't see the mist. I mean, they've tested this. And then you're right. It depends on where the winds are. I mean, you could get if the winds were right, the way they model this in New York, you could expose several million people and have several 100,000 die. Because if you're exposed to anthrax and you don't get the Cipro, the antibiotics, within about 48 hours, the odds that you're going to die are like 90%. They're very high. So, and that's anthrax. Another model would be to get a contagion, one that is actually, infectious and contagious. We saw this in the movie Contagion, by the way. It wasn't actually a weapon, but it's the same thing that could occur in nature.
Or that book, The Hot Zone, or the Dustin Hoffman movie, Outbreak, or something like that.
The guy goes to the airport and he pretends to be spraying the plants at the airport. And all he's got to do is infect, a dozen people who then get on planes and go to different places, and pretty soon you got an epidemic. So, and is all this possible? Yeah. I mean, one of the hardest thing on this commission that you mentioned was it's so astounding, so terrible and evil, that most people, it's just hard for the average person to believe this is an actual risk, that this could actually happen. But we know the terrorists are trying to get the weapon. It fits their strategy. They have the organizational capability to do it. Al-Qaeda is now led by a medical doctor, Zawahiri. In the past, it was, bin Laden his background was in engineering. And the guy who's leading it now was in charge of the project in the late 90s, when we know they were trying to get a bioweapon.
I was going to say that when bin Laden was still in Sudan in the 90s, that they'd actually hired, of course, some Pakistani veterinarian to try and create a weapon. But the veterinarian didn't feel he was getting paid enough money and gave up on the project. And so then they found some Malaysian guy who had gone to Cal State.
Right. I mean, you really need several competent life scientists, and then invest $100,000 in a lab, and you can do this. This is why, everybody from Colin Powell to the directors of national intelligence, the President Obama, and President Bush before him have said that a bio attack is a tremendous danger. I think the number one danger. In fact, the director of national intelligence agreed with our assessment within several weeks. We publicly agreed with the assessment of the commission within a couple weeks after we'd issued it.
So you've made a number of recommendations in your in this section of the report. I guess here's the big question. Many of your phrases were written as the next administration should do X, Y, Z. And I think this was written probably before the election.
Yeah, this was the fall of 2008. Yeah.
Right, so you didn't know who the next president was going to be, so you just generally said the next administration should do this. Of these recommendations that you've made, for example, the United States should undertake a series of mutually reinforcing domestic measures to prevent bioterrorism. Recommendation 2, the United States should undertake a series of mutually reinforcing measures at the international level to prevent biological weapons proliferation and terrorism. Have we made any progress on it? Are you still, first of all, are you involved in this?
Yes, I am. What we did we did the same thing with the commission. The commission, as you said, was congressionally mandated. And it was the follow-on to the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission had asked the question, what do we do if the worst people in the world get the worst weapons? And our commission answered that question. Then we did the same thing the 9/11 Commission did. We took it private. Bob Graham and I made it a C3. And we then went through another exercise of issuing a report card. In fact, we've done several report cards since then on the government's, so the progress. It directly addresses your issue. The second report card we did, we hired the best consultants in this field. We wanted to do a stem to stern evaluation of our readiness to deal with the results of a biological, or to respond to a bio attack. I should step back and say, Lee, that it's more difficult to prevent a bio attack than a nuclear attack because a bioweapon is so much more flexible. It's just harder to stop. That doesn't mean we shouldn't. We need to do everything we can to stop it. And
Geiger counters can detect nuclear where
they can't detect bio.
There are no Geiger counters for bioweapons.
The advantage of bio over nuclear, if you can call it an advantage, is that it is possible to prepare for it and to build a medical infrastructure so that if the attack occurs, it's not a weapon of mass destruction. You limit, if you respond quickly enough, you limit the damage, the injuries and deaths. And so, and the better you do that, the more you deter the attack, because if they don't think they will have the effect that they want, they're not going to do it. So we did a long report on the resiliency of the American healthcare system and what the government was doing and not doing. And unfortunately, the government got a lot of failing responses on that. We're not stockpiling the drugs that we need. We don't have an adequate detection system in place so we know when an attack has occurred. We don't have the right surge capabilities in our healthcare system. So there's a number of issues where we need to address. And I know you're particularly concerned about whether Congress is contributing to the solution or is part of the problem in this.
Well, I noticed that in your report in the civilian section, that this that you just talked about was, even in that report, was a big deal. That you were saying that there was, that the public should be involved like they do in Britain, and that they can become eyes and ears for the authorities, like in Britain, where people are trained to not just that there's bad people out there trying to do stuff, but they're actually trained, here's what you must see, and then you know, oh my gosh, I need to report that. Right? We don't seem to be doing that in the United States, do we? It's like the government treats the people like we're just some adjunct to their game.
Yeah, it's been we have not educated and really recruited the natural dynamism of the American people, if you will, and the energy of the American people as well as we should have in a lot of areas. The right balance you want. You don't want people panicking or out there saying, but you want them conscious of the risk, particularly those who live in cities and densely populated areas. New York now is they get this better than the rest of the country. That's one of the things we found, because that's where the 9/11 attacks occurred. And New Yorkers sort of understand it. Again, you don't panic, but if somebody leaves a bag on a subway, and abandons it, well, you need to tell the subway, just as you would at an airport. Okay. And also, the government needs to do a better job of informing people of what the steps they can take to prepare in the event there is a bio attack, and also what these various pathogens are, what symptoms they will evidence, and just so people are aware. I mean, you can actually build that system out if you want, so that if you have medical professionals in neighborhoods, people are aware of that. There are kits that we give first responders, because they have to take, like it has Cipro in the kits, and we can make those available in the right circumstances, but we haven't made much progress in those areas.
So has that ever been tested here in the United States, some sort of a early warning system, or have we tried in places to tell the public, okay, this is what to look for, and they have responded or not responded?
I mean, look, one of the points that Bob and I always make is that there are thousands and thousands of people in the government working all the time to try and prevent this and then build a chain of resiliency so if it happens we can respond and limit the number of injuries and deaths. And the last two presidents, since we've been in, President Bush and President Obama, they obviously want to do everything that they can There is a lot happening, okay? The problem is, in our view, it's like we're running, but the terrorists are running faster. See what I'm saying? In other words, the gap between where we need to be and where we are is growing, not because we're not doing anything, but because the nature of this risk. And so we just simply have to speed up our progress.
Well, in your report, you say we've been extremely lucky.
Yeah.
And they have been extremely inept.
Yes.
The terrorists have been inept. They just can't quite. It's not like Monsanto or something where you're working in a very systematized way in order to get to an end product.
Right.
They don't seem to have that technique down, luckily.
Yeah.
But we can't rely on luck forever.
Right.
And so that takes us to where you were just going.
Our margin of safety is their ignorance, but we can't, you're right, you can't assume that they're going to continue to make mistakes. Now, there's always, and we didn't talk because we weren't mandated to talk about intelligence and what's happening abroad, but obviously intelligence collection is an effective tool against any kind of terrorist attack, because if you know who the bad guys are and what they're planning and where they are, you can stop them, okay? So we're on the other side of this, which is specific prevention measures and preparedness measures in the event of a bioattack. One good important concept for people to understand is that to prepare effectively for an attack, you need a chain of resiliency. There's a number of links to the chain. If any one of them is broken, you don't get the preparation. So you have to have detection. You have to know an attack has occurred. Mm-hmm. Now, there are systems in place, BioWatch systems, and the healthcare system monitors people who come into different places with different symptoms, which is another way that you know. But those monitoring systems are not linked well enough. We don't have enough real-time intelligence. So the detection is one link, stockpiling. You have to have the countermeasures available. Then you have to have a system for distributing them quickly to people. You have to have surge capabilities in the healthcare system, and you have to be able to remediate afterwards, particularly if you're dealing like anthrax. Because if they were to release anthrax in the New York subway system, for example, even if you prevented the attack from actually hurting a lot of people, the subway system would be unusable until they were able to remediate it. Mm-hmm. Well, think of the economic. I mean, you could make a city uninhabitable.
Well, after the anthrax attack, which occurred in Washington almost immediately after the 9/11 attacks, right. How long? I mean, the Senate building. I think one of the Senate buildings was shut down.
Yeah, it was like
Post
a year.
office was shut down.
Because to get, and we haven't put hardly any effort into this, and it would be relatively low cost. We just need the Department of Homeland Security to get accepted protocols for remediation. Anthrax is the big problem here because most contagious pathogens, they can't exist in nature that long. So, I mean, they die pretty quickly. So that sort of takes care of itself. But there are agents that you have to actually clean up, and we don't have the remediation abilities. A big problem that we found across all these areas was a lack of unitary authority. In other words, there's like several dozen people within the executive branch who have responsibility for little pieces of this. Well, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. The same thing in the Congress. As you know, there are dozens of committees that oversee this. Well, that turns congressional oversight into a negative because there are all these people in the executive branch reporting to all these different committees, none of whom have the whole picture. There's no integrated budget presented, so we don't, and the executive could do this, present a budget where they pull out everything that's being spent on preparation for a bioattack and present it in one unitary budget. So Congress can see what's working, what isn't working, where they need to move money around. So basically we just need, and this is probably the biggest structural problem, the failure of leadership, I would say, in the last two administrations, is for the president to look at this, to figure out how he wants to approach this, to keep it as a priority and make our response effective, and then to put a decision-making system in place that will achieve that. And we don't have that, which is the underlying issue.
Let's just clarify something here. Doesn't the Congress actually direct the administration through its funding mechanisms of what departments are going to exist and what their jobs are?
Yes.
So this really does come back to the Congress not having directed the executive department or supervised them close enough?
Yeah, it's both. And again, the presidents who are dealing with this obviously want to stop it, and a lot of people are working very hard to stop it. It's both. Congress is not overseeing this in any kind of they're not looking at the whole picture. They don't have one committee that looks at, like the contrast which we pointed out in the report and in our subsequent reports. In the Department of Defense is overseen by the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. That's it. So there's one committee and they get a body of expertise over time. They get a working relationship over time. And by and large, it's pretty constructive. The Homeland Security in general, including this field, is overseen by dozens. I mean, the Judiciary Committee, there is a Homeland Security Committee, Intelligence has a piece of this. There's so many different committees that have part of this, and they're all fighting for their own little thing.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Instead of looking at the overall
You've
picture.
been there. Why? Why does everybody feel that they want their little turf in this rather than trying to solve a problem?
Well, it's a failure of leadership. I mean, look, this is I'm going to give you the explanation, but this is not a justification. This is just an explanation. The Department of Homeland Security was created by taking functions from different agencies. So you took some from the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Commerce. I mean, there's a lot of different agencies put together. Well, the oversight system in Congress is based on the old model. So you had the Judiciary Committee, anything in Homeland Security that came from the Department of Justice is still overseen by the Judiciary Committee. Say, anything that came from Commerce, let's say, or from like the Treasury's function in stopping terrorist financing is overseen by the Finance Committee because they oversee the Treasury. And none of them want to give up that jurisdiction. And I think the chairmen of the Homeland Security Committee need to tell the leadership in both bodies that if they don't get this fixed, they're going to make a huge stink early in the next Congress. Just say, look, we're going to tell the people that we are failing to protect them the way we should because you guys aren't willing to buck the committee chairman and the ranking members. This is bipartisan. And get them to change their jurisdiction. It's it's inexcusable.
I read in your report that in many respects, Congress has barely made the transition from post-World War II committee structure, let alone the post 9/11, and that you've got huge numbers of guys who are more interested in their petty turfs than they are interested in a unified outcome.
Yeah, and Senator Graham and I have said on a number of occasions, with no varnish on it, I mean, we haven't whitewashed at this thing at all, that this is just irresponsible and inexcusable. You know, they constantly are criticizing the executive branch, and sometimes with justification. But the executive branch has done a lot more to try and organize itself in a way to be effective than the Congress has done. Congress has done nothing. I mean, nothing. And the executive branch is trying. I mean, the whole reorganization of the intelligence agencies, and there are some people who were for that, some people against it, and we reported on that also. It was our view that a lot of progress has been made in the intel community. But in any event, it was at least a serious and significant attempt to reorganize intelligence collection in response to the disaster of 9/11. Congress has made no such attempt. And it's just, it's just wrong. I mean, they know what the problem is, and they're capable of sitting down and confronting it if they want to.
We got about 5 minutes left here. Time goes by fast. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it turned out that, or probably our intelligence people knew that they had this huge illicit bio program and something like 50,000 scientists and technicians that were involved in the Soviets' program. The objective of the United States was to try and go over there and, I guess, pay for a cleanup and to try and get these scientists and technicians work so they don't go working for bin Laden. Talk a little bit about
actually, this is one area. I'm not personally all that optimistic about American-Russian relations in general. But this is one area where there has been a pretty good partnership.
This is when they were broke, right? When we first went to them, they were bankrupt.
Yes.
And so our money was good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons this has worked is that several successive Russian governments and the United States understand that this really is in their mutual interest. I mean, the Russian government does not want
the Chechens.
and others.
Right.
They want to stay in control
Right.
of this biological material, as well as on the nuclear side, the nuclear material. It's not in their interest or our interest or anybody's interest to have this stuff floating around out of control. And so they have worked with us on it, and we've been reasonably effective in identifying and locking down this material in Russia. The bigger problem on the bio side is in other countries which don't regulate or watch their laboratories at all. And in fact, there's a lot of examples which we talk about in the report of, a bio lab in some third world country that, their idea of storing the anthrax is to have a refrigerator with a sign in front that said, danger anthrax, and that's it. Mm-hmm. So, I think we have made some progress in that area in trying to make certain that they stay in control of the stuff. But
I just want to interrupt and say that in your report, you talk about here in the United States that observations at some of our labs, the level 3 and level 4 labs, that they didn't have security either. I mean, that you could actually watch scientists through the windows as they were working with bad stuff.
Now, there's actually been a lot of progress on that since the report, and the direction the government's moving in, which we think makes sense and have said so, is to, instead of trying to regulate everybody for everything, which is to categorize what are the most serious risks. So you slim down the number of select agents, but you make certain that you're in control of those. And that makes a lot of sense. And you do that with a partnership with the scientific community, because they don't want this stuff to get out either. Mm-hmm. So I think we've made some progress in that area, and mostly by executive order rather than legislatively, although Congress has been supportive.
We're really running short. That last thing that you said there I think is one of the more dangerous things to our society, is that by executive order instead of by it, because executive order is more like dictatorship, where you have one man or one office saying this is how you're going to do things, rather than the legislative process in which all this information is filtered together, and then finally, legislation comes out of a process.
Right. This is mostly, though, executive realignment of regulatory jurisdiction. So, in other words, it's the president controlling the people who are doing the regulating.
Who work for him.
Yes, who work for him, exactly.
All right.
That's mostly what this is. And the extent that they have revised the actual regulations, they've done it in pretty good partnership with the scientific community. So this is an example of, but the executive orders relate to internal executive things.
Okay. In about the last 30 seconds here, just summarize where you think we stand right now.
Well, I think there's a lot of people working very hard, but it's our concern that the risk is actually on balance growing, and that we need to do a lot more in terms of preparing the country, so that in the event that such an incident occurs, we can limit the damage, which will then make it less likely that they'll try the attack in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, like we said, I mean, we barely touched this subject, but 30 minutes, I think we've at least given people an opportunity to understand. Thank you very much. We'll be back here in a little bit to talk about nuclear terrorism in just a little bit. Thank you.
That's great.
To the audience, been speaking with former Senator Jim Talent, who wrote a long paper about bioterrorism and a whole lot of other terrorisms. You got to look at it. Thank you. See you in a little bit. Bye.